Hello and welcome back to the Grid Podcast, your podcast about our electricity networks in Great Britain and their role at the heart of our transition to net zero, specifically about getting stuff connected to them. I am back today, Brian Moorhead, usual host, with Damian.
Hello.
The brains of the show behind the operation, as I've introduced in the previous episodes, if you're literally just joining us from the previous episode. And we're back again, all things connection reform, but this episode is focusing in on connection network design methodology, CNDM, which is currently out for consultation and is one of the meaty subjects around this whole connection reform piece. So just a very brief recap, and then I want to try and again keep this into bite-sized chunks, get into it, break it down simply, which is a task in itself, trying to simplify everything, but keep it short, but without losing too much detail. So just a very, very quick recap. We're now 3 episodes into our burst on all of the kind of, what would we call it, the autumn consultations.
Yeah, the big one.
Run up to Christmas consultation season or whatever we want to call it. So we touched on all of the different consultations that are going on, high-level summary, what's what. Then we did a little bit in that first episode on CMP 434, which is the kind of high-level codified structure of how it all works. Then we've touched on Gate 2. Gate 2 criteria methodology, which is out for consultation. That's what do you need to meet to get into the mix, to get allocated capacity. And now this is the kind of meaty one, if you like, is how they will actually allocate capacity, how they will form the queue, reorganize it, who's going to be the winners and losers, how are they going to decide the winners and losers. So this is probably the more contentious one, if there's going to be a contentious one. If that makes sense, does that sound about right, Damian?
Yep.
Good. Okay, we've covered the intro, and we'll basically start by covering the high-level objectives of CNDM. So please, apologies for using another acronym, but I'm just going to use it for the interest of time, because connection network design methodology is a real tongue twister. So the CNDM, sort of what is it trying to achieve? It's very big. It covers a lot of stuff. So let's just cover that. And then we're going to do our best to break it down into step by step how it will work, which, yeah, you might have to bear with us, but we're going to try and do that. And we're going to try and do it nice and simple and not taking up too much time. So just starting off, and then at the end of the podcast, we'll just touch on some of the key discussion points as well around, well, actually, there's one massive glaring issue, which I'll not spoiler alert at this stage. And there's a few other things that we will point out that you might want to look into in more detail or consider in your consultation response, basically, is what we'll try and wrap up with. And hopefully we can fit this into one episode, so let's rattle through. So basically, what is it? Well, I've kind of touched on it high level. So it's the process by which NESO will look to form the queue. It's also the process by which they will reorganize the current queue. So part of this is retrospectively reallocating capacity across the current queue, and then there's also the enduring process of how they're going to do this going forward. So that's about how they process capacity allocation and get Gate 2 offers out the door. It's also about how they do Gate 1 offers as well. We're not going to touch on Gate 1 too much on here. Basically, Gate 1 is now optional. It's basically a budget offer. That's as much as you really need to know about Gate 1.
Yep.
It is no longer essential. Apologies for that. So the other thing is, I suppose part of this is also allowing the transmission companies to do some anticipatory investment. Again, we'll touch on that briefly. Again, we'll probably come at this more from a kind of customer projects perspective, I think, here as well. And then there is mechanisms for how capacity will be reallocated and how the queue will move about and different things like that as well. But primarily, that is what it's here to do, is how does a Gate 2 offer capacity get allocated, a Gate 2 offer go out the door. And we'll touch on some of the discussion points as we go through. So let's try and break this down step by step. So effectively what NESO is going to do is there's a load of data gathering exercise before they do anything. So they basically need to kind of come up with a nationwide queue where everybody gets allocated like a unique queue number. And that's across distribution and transmission based on anybody that's in scope. So that's the starting point, which shouldn't be that difficult, but you do have to remember that there's, I don't know, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of projects in this queue. And it's across there's all the different DNOs as well as different TOs and everything as well. So you have to kind of start with a master queue, get everybody assigned a master queue number, and then basically set that queue down and identify the projects that meet the Gate 2 readiness criteria, which is basically land rights.
Yeah, land rights and strategic alignment.
Yeah. So it starts off, it's mainly the land rights. Let's just keep it simple at this stage. We might oversimplify a few things, but effectively, you've got your master queue, and then you go along, you pick out, right, well, who's got the land rights, the readiness criteria from Gate 2. So you filter those out that don't meet that test. You then look at any projects that have been identified for connection point or capacity reservation. We'll not get into that. That's basically maybe some offshore projects or whatever that might have a little bit of a buy ball on the land rights. But so let's ignore that step. So you've got the whole master queue and you've filtered out who doesn't have land rights. And you remove everybody else from the queue and then basically bunch that up if you like. So that's step one. That gets you your kind of nationwide sort of Gate 2 ready queue is what we'll call that. And then the next step then is taking this down to a regional level, isn't that?
Yep. So it's a sub queue for each region, for each technology.
And it's also split by transmission and distribution.
Yep.
So basically there will be 17 mini zonal queues at transmission, and then there'll also be an equivalent on the DNO side, which that'll be DNO license area rather than...
It's 14.
So there'll be 14 DNO sub-zone queues, if we call them that, and there'll be 17 transmission sub-zone queues. And this is then, if you're asking why are they doing this, that this is now where it comes to the alignment to the CP 2030, because basically those technology pots that we've discussed in the previous podcasts, so there's going to be regional levels, pots or targets, if you want to call them targets or quotas, of different generation technologies for each of those DNO subzones and the transmission subzones. So they're all going to be allocated separate quotas of solar, battery storage, wind, onshore and offshore. And we didn't touch on previously is those quotas will be different for distribution and transmission as well. So I think of some interesting stats in some of the consultation documents. I think they envisage most solar will be in the distribution pots, the majority of it. Battery storage, I'm not so sure on what the transmission.
Not off the top of my head.
Yes. First test, we've got Damian out on here, but we'll let him away with one.
So it's one of the graphs I don't have in my head.
Yes. He has been reading a lot in the last few days, to be fair. So yeah, they will split the queue then into those zones. So if you imagine you've got your queue ordered, it's ordered by, and it's been filtered out for Gate 2 readiness. And then this is actually where it gets a little bit interesting. They'll then determine the planning status of each project in the queue. Now, the slides that NESO have released in this are quite good. It's like all red, amber, green. We love a good RAG status. So basically, if you imagine it has planning, it's green, it's in planning, it's orange, and it hasn't started planning yet, so it's purely only got land rights, then they've assigned it the colour red, if you like. So if you imagine you've got this queue order, but the planning status could be all mixed, because the queue is still ordered by application date at this stage, but the application date is like...
It's Gate 2 readiness date.
Yeah. No, it's been filtered on Gate 2 readiness, but it's actually ordered on, it's probably, I think at transmission, it's acceptance date, I think is what transmission goes by. We'll maybe try and clarify that. It's either application date or the date the offer was accepted. Minor clarification either way. So it's still ordered based on that at the minute. They will then re-jumbo the queue based on planning status. So to give you an example, if somebody has planning that applied and accepted in 2020, there's somebody in planning that applied and accepted in 2021, and then there's somebody that also has planning that applied and accepted in 2022. The person in 2022 with planning will move ahead of the person in 2021, but they won't, and so the planning will give you a priority in the queue. So this is kind of the first time we've really seen this come out in sort of formal documentation, that this is all new information based on, compared to the previous consultation that most people would have seen. So there will be a mix-up in that queue based on planning status. And then effectively what they will do is go down the queue until that technology quota gets filled. So you're going to have these sub-regional queues at transmission distribution. They're then going to be broken into technology-specific queues, and then they will sort them based on planning, and then effectively look down the list of the queue until they hit the quota for that technology. Okay, solar's 2 gigawatts here. That, and there might be enough stuff with planning that's got 2 gigawatts. That might be where they draw the line. There might not be anything with planning, so it might be people without planning that get allocated the capacity before they make the cut. So that is effectively, and we should say this is all primarily generation focused here, because this is the alignment to those CP 2030 buckets.
Which demand is out of scope.
Which demand is out of scope. So this is all primarily a generation process at this point in the little sub-technology pots, if you like. So that's where they'll draw the cut. To make things more confusing then, they will then put the queue back into that kind of application date or acceptance order. And then that technology subset goes back in then to the master queue for that region. Again, back to being based on the application date.
Yeah, so the only queue that's reordered back to the relative position is anything pre-2030. If you're post-2030, you stay with the planning organization. So if you're pre-2030, you go back to your relative position.
Yes, so and again, just to clarify, pre-2030, you're meaning, well, we haven't actually explained that yet. So there's the CP 2030, so there's the 2030 technology quotas.
Yep.
There is then the 2035 technology quotas. So we should explain this point and then come back to yours, because this is all important. The first quota is so they've looked at the queue and they'll go along until they hit the 2030 quota and they'll draw a line there.
Yep.
They will then basically anything behind that will then sit in the 2035 quota.
Yep.
And then there will be another line drawn that will then, so you'll get allocated into 2 pots. It's called, I think they're calling it phase 1 and phase 2.
Yep.
So phase 1 is
from now to 2030,
and phase 2 is from 2031 to 2035. So you'll get cut into one of those 2 pots. So then, just coming back to the point you just made, if you're in the phase 1 pot, between now and 2030, the queue will go back into that application date or acceptance date order. But if you're in the phase 2 queue, it will stay in
with the planning order.
Okay, I hadn't picked that up, so I'm there. There you go.
Planning will come as a bigger benefit if you be in the phase 2 pot.
The later you are.
Yep.
That is interesting. Okay, good. So that is but those little mini technology queues then will then get reassembled back in to a master queue.
Yep.
Back to being based on kind of application date again, but obviously it's slightly different then it's still going back to application date when it mixes with other technologies.
Yeah.
And as well, it's when those technology pots go back into the master queue, that's where they'll get filtered in with the likes of demand projects that don't have the technology pot process.
Yeah.
So again, they'll go back into application date order. So if there was a data center with it'll go back into what the queue kind of looked like before, just with any of the technologies that didn't make the cut filtered out, plus any of the people that haven't made gate 2 readiness filtered out. So if you're still with us, effectively all that's happened by this point is the main queue, the phase 1 queue, is still in date order, and it's basically a lot of different renewable technologies will have been cut out based on not making the quota, and or not, all projects will have been tested against the land rights and the gate 2 readiness. So I do recommend you look at the NESO document for this. They do have a nice little color-coded chart that kind of tries to explain it, and it is worth just trying to get your head around. And again, it's worth thinking through from a phase 1 and a phase 2 and even a latter perspective. There is a bit then about designated projects coming into the queue. Project designation, which is another methodology that's out for consultation. We'll cover that probably briefly in another podcast. It doesn't help too much in the phase 1 queue. You kind of just, again, have your application date or whatever order. But it does get you to the front of the phase 2 queue if you're in phase 2. which is interesting as well. Okay, I think we've kind of covered the basics. It's probably worth moving on to the various discussion points here. So we've touched on the 2 phases. So you basically phase 1, that pre-2030, phase 2, 2031 to 35. There is some nuances there, which, I wasn't even over the detail on, to be fair to Damian. And we've covered the fact that the pots are all going to be split between transmission and distribution as well. One of the big things then is the government originally set the parameters around CP 2030. I think we briefly touched on this in the previous podcast. The one of the main reasons for having this phase 2 2035 pot is also that it acts as a contingency pot. So there will be attrition in the phase 1 pot. Projects will not get planning, or they'll fall through for whatever reason. So that is where then somebody in phase 2 can basically put their hand up to say, well, look, if somebody drops out and there's a chance I could be ready to go by 2030, so I want to be considered for advancement. Yeah,
there's the same mechanism if that phase 2 project moves to phase 1. There's projects sitting in gate 1 that can be moved to phase 2.
Yes, and again, we didn't actually touch on that. So you'll have people that get allocated an offer for phase 1. You'll get people allocated an offer for phase 2. You'll have people that don't make the cut at all, and basically just get left in phase 1. Gate 1, which is basically the budget offer wilderness. But you can sort of sit there with your hand up to kind of be the first person pulled into phase 2 if possible. So there is some specifics around advancement. I do recommend, again, I reckon with all of this, all we can do is a very high level summary. With all of this, I do recommend you do look at the advice in detail, because there's a lot of specifics under the scene, and it all affects different businesses and different projects in different ways. The one thing in there, it doesn't mention advancement in terms of demand. I believe that is just a bit of a typo, because obviously a lot of this is quite generation driven. So demand projects can put their hand up for advancement. The one thing though is it is quite specific on the advancement is technology specific. Sorry. So that probably might be something demand and the likes of data center people might want to pick up in their consultation response, because there's a lot less likelihood, a lot smaller number of demand projects. So there's a lot less likelihood of somebody
the term like for like is used. If demand drops out, the odds of another demand being like for like is unlikely.
It's a lot slimmer just through volume alone. Never mind the variability in demand projects, and the fact that these queues are all regional and sub-regional and things as well. So that might be something in terms of capacity or like bay allocations and things like that as well. Just by virtue of volume, the likes of solar and storage is a much better chance of advancement. So that's one thing we kind of picked up on. The other, there's a piece on hybrid projects. I know this came up at NESO's event in London. I'm not going to cover it. We're not going to cover it here in this podcast. All I would advise you is if you've got a hybrid project, i.e. wind and solar, battery solar, pay attention to the consultation, read it in a bit of detail, and there's definitely some stuff you might want to respond to in the consultation around that. There's definitely some kind of grey areas and different bits and pieces. I think they'll probably get it worked out, but for now, can do no more than draw attention to it, or else we'll go down a rabbit hole. And then other kind of talking points then, one good thing is they are going to publish the outcome of the queue, that whole queue process that we just described, so that adds a bit of transparency and that definitely helps. That's been a big kind of gripe of industry with the whole transmission queuing thing. And
they'll also publish, I know we'll cover it later in the designation podcast, but they'll also publish any decision made, even if it's a positive or a negative decision
on project designation as well. So again, that's positive. Another point is kind of undersupply or oversupply in different zonal queues. They have said if there is an undersupply of a certain technology, i.e. say there's not enough solar in this area, they will advertise that and put out a call for projects. They haven't said if there is an oversupply whether they might put out a call or a signal to say that this might be a good area to connect demand. So that might be something some people want to pick up in their consultations. And as well, in terms of the whole advancement thing, there's also a bit around zonal substitution. So if somebody does drop out, there might not be somebody in the 2035 batch or whatever with the same technology to fill. They may then look to, let's go to the next neighbourhood zone over the border and see if we can reallocate pots there. And as we said in the previous podcast, these pots are going to move about a bit slightly anyway. They're currently only in a bit of a draft form, and it has been made very clear that it's going to be government's decision to set those pots anyway. But as demand kind of rises and things, I'm kind of guessing that the demand forecast to 2030 is probably relatively stable. I would definitely expect the 2035 pots to change. So yeah, but anyway, I think we picked up in one of the previous podcasts, the setting of those pots is quite a controversial item in its own right. So there'll be a lot of interest around that.
The pots at the minute are only guidance to government, still requiring a decision.
Exactly. And then as demand on the network shifts as well, there's loads of different things there. And then there is stuff in it as well about aligning to strategic special energy plans when things like that come along. So again, it's kind of set up to evolve, really. There's a lot of terminology in CMP 434 about it being the minimum viable product and all that kind of thing. So I suppose this might not, for anybody that's spending their weekends reading consultation documents at the minute, it probably doesn't bring a lot, this is not the end.
Yep.
This is only an evolving.
It's only the start.
Yes, this is now it's a very comprehensive start.
Yep.
But this will evolve and continue to move as we go. And then before we pick up in the biggest topic that I personally think needs discussed and responded to in the consultations, the other thing, we've already said it in the previous podcasts, the mod app and technical change guidance, i.e. what changes can you make?
Yep.
You've went through this whole massive process to get into the queue, but then you need to, update your inverter specs, or you're looking to change technology types or whatever. What changes can you make without kind of being kicked out or kicked to the back? That guidance is still pending, and we're expecting that in calendar Q1 next year.
Yep.
So that's some really key docs.
There has been comments from DNOs to the work group consultation that it should align in some way or another to the ENA guidance that currently exists for distribution.
So the ENA guidance, I was actually involved in it at the time, is worth referring to as well as a baseline. So that's important, and we'll probably podcast on that one once it comes out as well. And then that kind of brings me probably to one of the last big topics, and asked a load of questions about this. I think a lot of people did on NESO's event in London there, is embedded demand. So again, we've touched on it briefly in another podcast, but this is where the detail comes in. Embedded demand is out of scope of all of this. So if you are a distribution connected demand customer, which a lot of people are, still probably the vast majority of connections made to our networks fall into that camp. You're out of scope here. So if somebody comes in with a 50 megawatt, 100 megawatt, 200 megawatt data center, large factory or whatever, they could come in here at any time.
Yep.
So just to touch on timescales briefly, the idea is that whole queue process we've just went through, they'll freeze the queue, they'll spend 6 to 9 months. It's a 12-month process, but there's bits about that's application windows and stuff. They'll spend about 6 months doing all their studies, and then you could have a 300 megawatt project that's embedded demand drop in just when you're finalizing your studies. This is when I say when you're the NESO system planners finalizing their studies and about to start issuing gate 2 offers. So at the minute, it's currently very unclear. Will embedded demand, the whole idea of them not being in scope is nobody wanted to hold up embedded demand. But does that then mean that they get pushed to the back of the queue? Are they able to queue jump? Where do they go and how do they get treated? And then how does that impact then all of the people that are in scope here? Yeah,
the big issue is if DNO modification applications have to go through the gated process, or is there going to be a new process that currently exists?
So any questions raised for NESO so far is it's the existing mod app process. There is no gates and process, but how that aligns with this, I think it became very apparent. Nobody really knows, and it is something that's going to just have to be dealt with. And that's why these things go to consultation, is to get that feedback so that these types of issues get highlighted. So I do expect that to change. I expect there to be additional guidance, policy, whatever, come out around that, which again, depending where that limit's set and everything else, that could massively, we did on one of the previous episodes, we said, well, who's this podcast for? Depending on the answer to that question, that could impact nearly anybody that's trying to connect to the network, or they might set higher thresholds or whatever. I think we've done a reasonably good job in covering that at a high level. As I said before, or in the middle of the podcast, I do advise, please do go and look at this yourself, or have somebody looking at it for you. Obviously, this is only very high level. There's a lot of nuances here that impact different businesses, different developers, different investors, different projects in different ways. You do need to take your own project specific view on this, and in terms of how you develop your consultation response. So yeah, feel free if you want to reach out to us for some specific advice. We're happy to chat to whoever. We've been doing a lot of that with existing customers over the last week, and I'm sure we're going to continue to do so over the next week or two as well. So on that note, we'll try and come back with another episode as a bit of a wrap up on what it might mean for different projects at a high level, and try and put ourselves in the shoes of different types of developers and investors. But we'll wrap up there, and thanks very much for listening.
Thank you.